All right. So again, good evening, Obtec students, and welcome to our online sync. Today, we're going to discuss about one of the most important topics in readings in Philippine history. Also, before we get started, let me just remind you that I'll be asking some of you here some questions with regards to our discussions. Okay. So if you have something to say, if you have questions to raise, just tell me so that we can accommodate and then give you the floor. All right. Okay. Let me present now and let me open my slides so we can start. Okay. Let me open my slides. By the way, can you tell me if you are seeing my slides now?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Also, can you hear me clearly? Basing choppy or interference? Okay,
Clear,
Ra?
sir.
Okay, great.
Yes,
All
sir.
right, so our discussion for this afternoon is about Butuan or Limasawa. It's actually a question to whether asa mangyudi ay ang first mass na hitabo during the time when the Spaniards um, explored and tried to claim the Philippines as theirs, right? So for how many centuries, there are quite a lot of references that Butuan was the landing site where the first mass was ever recorded. But later on, in 20th century, it shifted. What we're going to discover is why it shifted and why for 3 centuries, starting from the 16th until 19th century, Butuan tradition man ang ato ang gituuhan na first ever recorded mass in the Philippines. Okay? Sige. Let's go to the first mass. Now, the question here is that it's a controversy of the first Philippine mass site in the Philippines. Pigafetta tells us that it was held on the Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1521, and the island was called Mazwa. There were two chieftain in attendance. It was Raha of Mazwa and the Raha of Butuan. The subject of controversy is the identity of the place called by Pigafetta as Mazwa. As we all know, if you are familiar here in Butuan, natay beach or a barangay in Butuan, we call it as Masaw, or some old folks would call it as Mazwa. There are several buildings, groups, and they are referencing it to Mazwa. And this has been part of the Philippine or Butuan tradition for so long. That's why many of the people believe that the first mass site here is actually in Butuan, right? And some of the evidences would suggest that it's probably, right? But again, these are controversies. And as of the moment, we're going to discuss why it shifted to Limasawa. Okay? Now, the very interesting part here is that we have the attendance of the Raha ng Butuan. If I'm not mistaken, the name of the Raha ng Butuan in this particular period, the name is Raha Kulambo. I forgot the name of the Raha of Mazwa, which basically, of course, from our claim today, coming from Limasawa, an island from Leyte. Okay? All right. Now, there are two conflicting claims of the identity of the island. First is the little island south of Leyte, which the map called Limasawa, and the second is the beach called Masaw, located in Butuan City, which is at the mouth of the Agusan River. So there are two conflicting identity now to whether where is the Mazwa that Pigafetta called where the first mass site on Easter Sunday happened. Okay? All right, so let's talk about first the Butuan tradition. Why for so long, for 3 centuries actually, that the people in the Philippines and all throughout the world believed that the first mass happened in Masaw in Butuan City. Okay? It claims to rest upon the tradition that was almost unanimous and broken for 3 centuries. Can you imagine how many years? It took us 3 centuries to believe that Butuan was the first mass site. Now, one of the fundamental evidences was the stone monument erected in 1872 located at the municipality of Magallanes in Agusan del Norte. Now, remember, the place Magallanes is named after Magellan, right? And there was a monument, a stone monument in 1872, declaring that the place is actually a part of a historical facts that contributes to the idea that the first mass site is basically happened, or it happened in Butuan, in particular in Masao. Okay, so these are some of tangible evidences that could possibly link to the idea of the Filipinos and to the rest of the world that it's quite hard evidence that people can believe that the Butuan tradition is actually factual, and it has good weight in trying to provide us an information that the first mass site happened not in Limasawa in Samar Leyte, but in Butuan in Masao. Okay? All right, so now we're going to dissect three traditions of the Butuan tradition coming from the 17th to 18th and 19th century. We're going to check who are the people behind the idea that these evidences happen in Masao in Butuan and why they believe it so. Okay? Now, there are two Jesuit historians made the careful claims of the Butuan tradition. Namely, we have Father Francisco Colin and Father Francisco Combs or Combes. Now let's talk about Colin's claim, Father Colin's claim. Now for Colin's narration about the voyage of Magellan to the Philippines was accurate up to the landing of Humonhon. After that, it became vague. He abruptly brings Magellan to Butuan without explaining how he got there and brings him back to Limasawa and even misspelled it as Limasawa. Okay, so again, there was a fact and there was a correct and accurate information that Magellan's crew landed in Humonhon, right? But after which there is now vagueness on the correct claim. How did Magellan were able to reach Butuan, and what are the passages or the routes they took in order to transfer from Leyte going to Butuan at that time? And that is one of the error on Colin's claim. Okay, he wasn't able to present correctly how did Magellan and his crew was able to go and land in Masao. Okay. Furthermore, the important thing in Colin's account, as far as our present purpose is concerned, is the fact that he represents the first mass, as well as the solemn planting of the cross and the formal taking possession of the islands in the name of the Crown of Castile, as having taken place at Butuan on Easter Sunday of 1521. Okay. It was King Carlos at this time. Yaman ang anak si Kuano, si Philip. So at this time, the crown in Spain was actually coming from King Carlos, right? Of course, 50 years later, niabot si Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, naming the entire archipelago as the Philippines in honor of the king at that time, King Philip II. Okay? So at this time, so very moment pa, si Carlos pa ang hari ani when Magellan was sent to circumnavigate the world. No? Well, accidentally, to circumnavigate ni Magellan, proving that the world is actually not flat, but it's spear or round. Okay? All right, again, the most important part of Colin's account or claim is that, well, it gives us the idea that there was really a mass happened during the time of Magellan's expedition. Okay, and there was a formal planting of the cross, and that's a big evidence telling us or telling the world that during the time of Magellan's expedition, there was really a mass that happened, and also the cross signifying a claim of the King of Castile in Spain. All right. Now let's talk about Combs' claim. All right. So again, there are two Jesuit fathers who actually wrote a book on how of Magellan's expedition, and as well as trying to provide an information that there was a first mass, but its ambiguity causes a problem later on. Now, aside from Colin, we have Combs. He claimed and point out in his account Magellan landed in Butuan and there planted the cross in the solemn ceremony. So they're both unanimous, right? So Colin and Combs believe that Magellan landed in Butuan and then planted the cross and held the first ever mass in the archipelago. Now, Combs does not mention the first mass. Sorry, but Combs did not mention the first mass, but mentioned two events from Pigafetta's account, which had occurred on the same day as the first mass. So it wasn't specific that it's the first mass, but there are events in the first mass that was mentioned by Combs. Okay, so that's quite a difference between Colin, because Colin's very specific that there was really a first mass happening with one. But for Combs, in that particular event that there was a first mass, he is not certain that there was a first mass, but there are correctness on the claims that happened in the first mass where Combs actually accounted. All right. Now, there is the planting of the cross and the formal claiming of the archipelago. You see? So this is the claim of Combs together with Colin. They both are correct that there was really the planting of the cross and claiming of the archipelago. But for Combs, he wasn't able to mention the first mass. Instead, ang planting lang of the cross and claiming the entire archipelago as part of the empire of the King of Castile. Okay. All right. So if we compare Combs and Colin, so these are the results, no, in the 7th century Butuan tradition, comparing both of the Jesuit historians on how they provided evidences and what are the correctness of their claims. So for Combs and Colin, both pictured Magellan visiting Butuan and Limasawa. In Colin's account, Magellan went to Butuan, then Limasawa, and then went to Cebu. Right? If you can recall some of the discussions that he had before in the Philippine history, actually the Prince of Butuan went together with Magellan because they are cousins of the king of Cebu at that time, which is Humabon, right? So igagawa na sila. So the prince or the king of Butuan actually went with Magellan, guiding them in order to reach Cebu, and they were welcomed by Humabon. But of course, we know the history that the other island, the adjacent island of Cebu, which is Mactan, didn't really like the idea of having white people in the archipelago. So Lapu-Lapu was very concerned about it. And then eventually, the war happened in Mactan. And then, as the story goes, Magellan dies, Elcano, and the remaining cruise ship of Magellan continued the circumnavigation and then went back to Spain. Again, going back to our discussion, in Colin's account, Magellan's visit was Limasawa and then Butuan, and returned to Limasawa and then going to Cebu. So again, they have quite of similarities when we talk about how they reach Limasawa and went to Butuan, where eventually they believe that the first mass had happened. Well, for Colin, it was very specific, but for Combs, there was quite of differences, but still considered to be a factual event that a mass had happened. All right, and then both believe that after they went to Butuan or maybe going to Limasawa, they then went to Cebu. Okay. All right. So, if you have questions before we proceed to 18th century tradition ng Butuan, you can raise it now. Or perhaps I'm going to probably ask you questions so far. No? Before we move on. Sige, mangungutan ako sa inyo ha. So, in 17th century, why do you think that Combs and Colin believe na sa Butuan man, without even acknowledging a possible route na nakaabot sila from Limasawa, tapos nakaabot sila og Butuan, but wala nila ma-emphasize giun sa pag-abot nila Magellan dito sa Butuan. Karon ng pangutana nganong for a century, the entire 7th century gituuhan mangyapon na. What was missing during the time? Nganong all throughout the world nituo man sila. Nga sa 17th century tinuod yun nga sa Butuan man ang first mass. Even without realizing na naputol gani ang description ni Combs and Colin and how they did get to the island of Butuan after they reach Limasawa. So muna ito ang question. Now there's vagueness on anong yun sa Manila pag-abot anong lugar. No, the problem is gituuhan pag sa kadaghanan for at least a century, no? Nakabot lang gid sila diha. Okay? So that's one of the puzzle, but later on nato na siyang ma-answer. Okay? So muna siya yung una-unaon. Anyways, anybody would like to raise the questions or should we proceed? Sige, if it's clear, you can type 1 in the chat box. So I'll be able to see your responses. Or perhaps if you have questions, no, you can just write it down sa chat box na to. Sige. So if things are clear, let's move on to the next slide and discuss the 18th century. In continuation, both agree that it was from Limasawa with the help of the chieftain of Limasawa that Magellan went to Cebu. Both agree that Magellan arrived in Cebu on the 7th of April, 1521, 1 week after the first mass, which both believe to have held at Butuan. Both authors have been repeatedly cited by some writers until it shifted in the early 20th century. Can you imagine? Dili lang the entire century, the 17th century, no, gituuhan sa entire civilization ng ating planet, that it really happened in Butuan. But it took at least 3 centuries because up until 19th century, people are still citing Colin and Combs' work when we talk about the first mass site in the Philippines. Okay, so it took us at least 3 centuries believing it did really happen in Masao, in Butuan City. Okay, but of course, later on, if there are really evidences that could prove better than the account of Pegafetta and Albo, no, from their recordings, then it is possible that the history will be shifted back to Butuan. But up until today, since the strongest first account sources that we can get comes from the accounts of Albo, one of the chronicler of Magellan, at the same time Pegafetta, who also wrote the entire experiences that they have with Magellan during their expedition. Anyways, let's move to 18th century. All right, so after the 17th century, where Combs and Colin arguably one of the best sources when we talk about getting information to where the first must happen, well, let's talk about 18th century and what are the other evidences or facts that we can present where still this very stage, no, or this very moment of time, still well, people believe that still in Butuan. All right. So in continuation, one passage of Colin, which seems to have been misunderstood and misled writers, and thus committing an error in narrating the travel of Magellans. Like what I said, Colin did not say Magellan first sighted the Cape of San Agustin and sailed northwards along the Pacific coast of Mindanao, rounded Surigao Point, and then sailed westward to Butuan. So this is now the other inclusion, no, of some of the writers to prove a point that it did that Magellan really went to Butuan and then went back to Limasawa and then moved to Cebu. Okay, so some of the writers actually pointed, no, that there are ways and routes where it's possible Magellan have reached Butuan, and basically they have pointed the Surigao Strait. Okay, if you can probably see on the map, Surigao and Leyte, they are very close. So kung ganahan ka mula og Leyte, pwede ka manakayin sa Surigao, and pwede ra ka mo sakay og gabi, pag-abot yung buntag, abot na ka og Leyte, and vice versa. Okay, because these are the waters facing the Pacific that have the same flow of water and basically could lead you to the same route of the water, right? Of course, if mabot ni Mang Surigao, then we're very close to Butuan. And at that time, Butuan is one of the best early civilizations in early Philippines. What it gave the Butuanan an advantage to be known not just in the entire Caraga or probably entire Mindanao, and also it reaches far to Cebu. It's because aside from the fact that we have good ports here for trade routes, we are also near to the Agusan River. in the Gusan River, as we all know, or of all the rivers in the entire planet, rivers are actually life giver. So most of the civilization started near or close to the rivers or to the waters, right? So it's very interesting to note that it is possible that Magellan could probably see an entire new civilization um, near Surigao, which is Butuan. If it did really happen that Magellan went to Butuan via Surigao Strait. All right. Moving on now, indeed, in another place, he mentioned that Magellan had entered the Philippine waters farther north, namely near Samar, landing first to Humonhon, which is actually correct. All right. But again, a confusion is if we wanted to pursue that Magellan really went to Butuan and then, had the first mass, why is it that there's no mention from Albo and Pegafetta's account that they really went to Butuan, right? Or if there's a passage that could prove that it's possible that they have reached Butuan via Surigao Strait. But of course, in 18th century, it seems that there is, okay? Now, but some of the careless readers of Father Colin believe that Magellan entered the Philippine waters through the Strait of Siargao, or actually Surigao, no? And this is what I have been, just telling you about. That still they have based all of their works, no, in 18th century from the works of Colin and Combs at that time. But they have improved their writing and then eventually put an emphasis that Magellan have reached Butuan through the Surigao Straits or the Siargao Strait. Okay? Of course, in the 17th century from Colin and Combs' account, wala gini na mention. And that's one of the confusing and actually an error to the writing, right? On how did it happen that there is really a first mass happened in the Philippine waters. I mean, in Butuan waters, if Magellan did not, or Albo and Pegafetta, no, did not even mention an area or a route where it reaches the Butuan, waters. Anyways, this account has been widespread up until 19th century. One of the major historians who made this error was Fray Juan de la Concepcion, right? Again, an error because they have not been able to find an accurate account from an original source, right? We have discussed this before in your modules as well, that there are sources of history. Sources of history are evidences that could prove and put weight on the claims that you want, right? So an account coming from a person who experienced that event is the first source. And Albo's logbook and Pigafetta's chronicles are the example of the first sources of history. And we cannot discount it as if it's just the second or third source of history. Because again, by evidence, they are the first people who have witnessed the event. Okay, but of course, in the 18th century, even though there are errors committed by Fray Juan de la Concepcion, still they were able to accept it. Okay, and it again ran up until 19th century. All right, so Fray Juan de la Concepcion has misread his sources and mixed up several things. Like, first, he seems to think that the island called Las Velas in Marianas Island and the archipelago of San Lazaro were all one and the same thing. Basically, they are not. Marianas Island is actually located in the island, it's a tiny island in the Pacific, right? Las Velas as well is not part of the Philippines that we know of. San Lazaro is actually part of Leyte. But again, in his reading, he actually mixed it up and actually joined it all together, believing that this is just one Las Villas, all right? Or, Marianas or San Lazaro. They're the same, but it's not. Okay, so that is one thing to note on how an error was committed by Fray Juan de la Concepcion. Now, he has misconstrued Magellan's route, depicting him as sighting in the southern tip of Mindanao and sailing northwards along the Pacific coast of this island, and then entering the Siargao Strait into Limasawa as the entrance of the strait. So basically, para sa iya, Fray Juan believed that una niya nakita is not actually the island of Humonhon in Leyte, but actually a tip of the southern part of Mindanao, where it led him going to the Surigao Strait, moving to Butuan where the first mass has happened, and then moving to Limasawa, and then Limasawa to Cebu. Okay, so that is one thing that have been cleared when we talk about the 21st century shift of the claims of the first mass. But in this century, the 18th century, what happened was, again, an error from the 17th century committed by Collin and Combs was still copied and actually misled again the readers because nanay dagdag and bawas, no? Because of an error committed by the authors in this century. All right. Okay, so we've already known that it still exists in the 18th century, but also in the 19th century, still we can see an amount of errors that have been passed to this generation or to this century. So at the beginning of the 19th century, one of the important writers who accepted the Butuan tradition was the Augustinian Fray Joaquin Martinez de Zuniga. He said in his work, on Easter Sunday of the year 1521, Magellan was in Butuan. He ordered the sacrifice of the Mass to be celebrated ashore, and he planted a cross on the hilltop near the beach, claiming, of course, that this island now belongs to the King of Castile. Again, even in the 19th century still, writers in this very moment or in this very time still believe from the errors committed in the 17th and 18th century. And one of the Augustinian Fray historian, Joaquin de Martinez de Zuniga, believe it so. Okay? So, but the 19th century Butuan tradition was taken for granted because writer after writer just copied the previous ones or the previous ones. Among the writers who cited Butuan tradition was John Foreman. He said, on the 16th of March, 1521, the Ladrones Island were reached. After a bloody combat, the fleet continued its course westward, coasting along the north of the island of Mindanao. They arrived at the mouth of Butuan River and met with the chieftain. It was Easter week and celebrated the first Mass in the Philippines. So again, it did not change at all, right? Even an English historian, John Foreman, believe it so, that's still the same thing, right? They have reached Limasawa, went to Butuan, and then planted the cross and, sacrificed the first Mass, and then went back to Limasawa again, and then moved to Cebu. So nothing has changed. Even in 19th century tradition, even there are new and numerous historians at this time who could probably read and find additional sources or probably critique some of the sources before, but it did not happen. They just followed and copied what was claimed by the previous authors from the 17th to 18th and even in the 19th century. Nothing's changed. But in the shift opinion, all right, so this is now the time where people started to realize that for 3 centuries, there are actually important critique that needs to be checked because it's very important to correct history. Okay? So the most important part in providing us the correctness of facts and evidences when we present and claim historical event in the past should follow a proper deliberation and a proper critique and a proper scientific processes in order for us to prove a point of one thing. Okay, and the shift opinion gives us the biggest turn of events, no, in believing that it was actually Limasawa than believing before in 3 centuries that it was Butuan. Okay. So the very question is, how did the shift opinion from Butuan to Limasawa come about or came about? No, yun sa man. So how was the Butuan tradition that is so well entrenched for 3 centuries finally dislodged? So blame it to Emma Blair and James Alexander Robertson. But the blame, if you call it, does not rest alone to Blair and Robertson. These are actually 21st century historians, no, who have read several books, most especially from Collin and Combs. Okay, because they were checking on the authenticity of the claim. Okay, but we will be getting the best of the explanations later. All right. So again, it seems to initially found to have an inclination of this shift opinion to a Spanish Jesuit by the name of Pablo Pastels. Okay? So isang Jesueta, but he was able to notice something is off on the claim of the authors before, right? So Pastel occasionally re-studied the accounts of Pegapetta and Albo. It was then that he realized that the 3rd century Butuan tradition had been erroneous. So imagine, in just couple of readings, no, balik-balik og basa. He used to believe it before, but then sa kadugayan niya og basa, especially from the accounts of Pegapetta and Albo, he was able to realize, compared to the accounts and claimed by Colin and Combs, that there are quite a couple of dislodge or problems on the claim of Colin and Combs. And then he realized it and then put it into writing that there are errors coming from the first source, of course, no, from Albo and Pegapetta, to in comparison to what was claimed by Colin and Combs. So itong ipang sulat, hinahinay yung sulat, until such time it has published a complete account of correctness ng claim ni Pastel. All right, so for him, it had taken 3 centuries before the accounts of Pegapetta and Albo were reread and rediscovered for scrutiny. Even Rizal did not know much of Pegapetta, for he wrote a letter to Marcelo H. del Pilar saying that an account of the early exploration of Spain to the Philippines was displayed in the British Museum. Diba I asked you earlier, ano mang nitagal man, ug at least 3 centuries before people realized there was an error, because the sources of Pegapetta and Albo's work were actually displaced from the moment they arrived in Spain, and then Pegapetta went back to Italy, and then Albo also went back to his home country. No, Pegapetta, of course, published at least 5 books in relation to the expedition that they had with Magellan, but it wasn't really taken for granted that the copies of this book were just sold very minimal, and then all throughout the time it just passed, and then the original book and the original account were then later found in the museums only. That's why when Rizal went to the British Museum, no, in England, he was surprised that he even did not know the existence of this yet, right? That there was a writing from the first people who arrived in the Philippines, no? He wanted Del Pilar to actually decipher and translate it from because it was written in Italian or in Latin by Pegapetta. He wanted Del Pilar to write it in Spanish, or if it's possible to translate it into Filipino, so it's easier for them to, or for the people of the Philippines, no, to see and know the history of the beginning ng exploration sa ating bansa, right? But of course, Rizal wasn't able to do it because nagsige na po siya sulat at nga time, no, sa iyang mga novels, and he was busy. Marcelo H. del Pilar, for whatever reason, wala po niya ni mataganog og dakong emphasis, because probably wala siya kadto sa museum, no, and wasn't able to copy it one by one. Anyways, again, at least Rizal made mention of this account, giving us an idea why, again, tulo ka century, no, walay ni question ani. It is because it's hard to find a concrete and first source of evidence. Can you imagine, later na found out nila nga there was a copy, no, found in the British Museum. But for 3 centuries, the authors were just relying from the previous authors, who actually probably have read the original manuscript but wasn't able to really read it properly. That's why it committed a lot of error and confusion, of course, in the modern day time, where available sources and any kind of experimentation can be done in order to facilitate, no, the correctness of a document. So 20th century pa, thanks to first this, we have to thank Pastel, or Father Pastel, for trying to restudy the accounts of Pigafetta and Albo. Wasn't able to realize also later that nagilay sayo. And later, Blair and Robertson gave us a different view because they were able to translate it in English. Let's go this page. So thanks to Blair and Robertson's service to the Philippines in translating Pigafetta's account from Italian to English that the erroneous interpretations of our early history was corrected. Just like what I said, si Blair and Robertson gave us the correct perspective because the two of them were able to translate properly the account of Pigafetta and even from Albo, and declaring that there are really errors committed from the previous authors in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Here comes 20th century. In a very few span of time, we're able to get the correct grasp of what happened really during the first exploration of Magellan, who landed in the Philippines. Okay. All right, so that's the end. That's the end of this discussion because in your module, dito man ninyo makita ang accounts ni Pigafetta and ni Albo, giving us an idea na mao dito siya ang mga claims nila thanks to Blair and Robertson na tagaan taog hayag na kung ano na footing on understanding the beginning of our history. Okay, let me just stop presenting so we can move on to our sharing or an open forum. All right, so that's the summary, no, of what happened between Butuan and Limasawa tradition. A summary of giving us a deeper understanding and appreciation why it's very valuable for us to find correct sources of history and does not rely only on things presented to us, right? If we make parallel examples, no, of what has been committed before, pwede na to na may example ang mga fake news nga to ang mabasa online, right? Sa inyo ha, no? How many times have you read fake news man online? And the question is, yun sa man yung pagkahibalo na fake news na siya. Sa ato ang previous generation, no, for 3 centuries na nilabay, at least tulo ka century before na nahibawan sa tao na naay error or fake news related siya. But kita, because of the advent of technology, at least dali ta makadecipher to whether it's fake news. Okay? So, in order for us to know whether the idea nga inyong makita or mabasa online is fake, unsa man yung mga parameters or unsa man yung mga kanang measures na ginabuhat para dili mo mailad sa fake news or unsa man yung mga processes na ginabuhat tapos ma-realize ninyo nga fake news na siya or yun sa man yung pag-identify nga fake news na siya sa kabutang. Pwede mag-share ng uban? Pwede po niyo i-type inyong answer sa akong chat box? Sige, Miss Agan, do you have something to say?
Sir, okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Makabalo mi sir nga fake news among nabasahan nga information kung among nabasahan is dili nagikan sa reliable nga sources, sir.
Okay, correct. How do you identify man if that is a reliable source?
Kuan sir kanang gikan siya sa mga kuan dagko nga network like mga Philstar,
Okay.
GMA News, ABS-CBN, ana sir.
Yeah, okay, correct, no? Of course, if renowned na sila hold na credibility. But for medias like this, there are also times that they commit the biggest nga mga problems sa journalism because there are actually some of the reports, no, na nag-claim sila but it did not really happen and they were actually receiving backlash from a lot of communities. Though minimal, but still some of the networks, no, nakakommit na sila og mga errors in journalism. That's why very critical mangud pud karon, no, ang 21st century na mga netizen grabe ka critical on trying to tell us na may mali aning gi-post nila, no? Quite a few sa Rappler, if you are familiar with Rappler, there are also quite a few even in ABS-CBN News, even in GMA na po sila na commit na error. Some of the renowned the mga kana newspapers nato have committed also journalism mistakes or actually mga gipangtuyo gyud nga mistakes. Very minimal but there are reports na makahatag sa ato og kuan kana ganing idea na ang information pwede rin siya ma-twitch. Just like what happened 3 centuries ago when we are talking about the first mass in the Philippines. Okay? Now, manong grabe man ka-significant para sa tuang mahibawan kung asa ang first mass sa Pilipinas. Manong gidebatihan man gid siya pagmaayo. Up until today nganong naa pa man gid siya nga discussion. Unsa man gyud ay nganong importante man kayo mahibaw-an nato ang first mass sa Pilipinas. Others can actually raise your answers here. You can tell me. Or others also can put your answers in the chat box if maulawon gamay. Sige, Ralph, do you have something to say, Ralph? Why it's very important man nga mahibaw-an gyud nato ang first mass? What's relevant for the Filipinos up until today? Anong relevant man siya?
Yes, sir. For me, it is very relevant and important. First of all, because it defines our own identity as a Filipino, knowing that Spaniards colonizes our country for 333 years. And another important thing to consider is that it is also fitting to note that this year, our country is celebrating the 500 years of Christianity in here in the Philippines. And then what is we it is important to know the history, because what is the essence of celebrating such Christianity even if we don't know first kung asa jud nahitabo ang first mass. So it defines our own identity as a Christian country, as a Filipino, and as a kanang the whole Philippines.
Okay. Correct on the part of defining the culmination of the Philippine Christianization, no, because it was really the beginning of our history with regards to Christianity. But defining Filipinos, which marks only the beginning where Spanish colonizers have arrived in the Philippines, is incorrect. All right, we have already established a civilization prior to their coming. Okay, we have already a lot of kingdoms, influenced by the Muslims, kingdoms influenced by the Hindus, and even kingdoms influenced by the traditional early Filipinos at that time. So probably dili na to tagag value ang idea that we were able to get an identity during the time only nga niabot ang ato ang white colonizers. Okay, because prior to that, no, before the colonization in the 16th century, we were able to have at least a lot of communications beyond our own borders. We've already established trade routes between China, between other Southeast Asian countries, even in Middle East, and as far as also India, right? So these are the things that we have to consider, especially if you are thinking of enrolling probably when you reach second year to social sciences, is the correctness of the discussions in historical accounts that we will tell to our students. Okay, but correct, if we wanted to tell everybody that it marks the beginning of Christianity in the Philippines, then that's correct. Okay, also it marks the beginning of a long period of colonization, which we all know it didn't give us a lot of favor for the Filipinos, though there are positive effects of colonization because it paved the way for globalization. It paved the way to the early idea of globalization and internationalization, right? And also, it paved the way to nationhood, right? Because prior to colonization, just like what I said, there are separate kingdoms in what we call now as Philippines. There are kingdoms located in the southern part of Mindanao, no, the Sultanate Kingdom. Na yung mga kingdom nga there's northern part, na like the Caraga Kingdom, no, led by the Butuan or Butuanons. So on with the Visayan region, and then of course the mainland, Metro Manila as we call it now. But we are not united as one Filipino that we know of today. So colonization gave us also a positive or a good side because it gave us nationhood. Of course, the nationhood was brought to oppression, came alive because we were beaten badly by the Spaniards at that time, not just physically, no, but emotionally, mentally, and even spiritually. We were told and believed to just follow because we are just the subjects of these colonizers. Okay? Sige. Now, apart from that, what else? What are the good things that you have learned, man, sa atuang discussion when we discuss about the correctness of evidences, especially knowing that Butuan used to be, no, the land site or the site where the first must happen. And what are your realizations? Para sa inyo ha, okay lang yun ba nga nasakop ka sa mga Espanyol at that time and then we embrace Christianity? Or do we have a choice at all? Or should we blame our ancestors, no, of accepting white colonizers? What are your thoughts, man, of what happened? Malikayan kaha nato ang colonization at that time? Walay mo share. Para sa inyo ha, mas maayo ba nga wala ta na colonize kanina lang? Para sa inyo mas maayo ba na wala ta na colonize sa mga Espanyol? Yes, na nag-raise ang hand si Bible. Si
Yes,
Bible
sir.
ba or sige Bible.
For me, sir, dili ang in my opinion, kaning it's better nga we are colonized by the Spaniards. It is because it opens a lot of doors for us Filipinos, especially in our education. We have learned a lot from them, and that is so kaning beneficial for us. And dili po nato ma-blame atong mga ancestors. Kaya it is because naghatag po ng good benefits ang pagka-colonize sa mga Spaniards sa tua.
Okay, correct, no? We cannot always blame what happened in the past. We just have to accept it and then try to relearn probably what are the things that they have missed at that time, no? Because it did happen. We don't have much of a choice from what happened in the past because we're living in the present. What we can do is to criticize and correct the faults of the past, right? But learning, those mistakes in the past is an important thing to do in the present. Okay, and probably it's an answer to our future problem. All right. Sige, what else? What are your thoughts pa about our discussion? At least we have 5 minutes more, no, to share.
Ako po, sir.
Sige, go ahead.
Ano po, may kanang naay negative o positive nga kanang murag effects bitaw ang pag-colonize sa mga Spaniard sa ato kay ang positive is kanang murag nakatabang to siya para ma-shape ang atong culture o ang ato bitawng kuan kanang murag nakatabang siya nga kanang pag-kuan bitaw nato sa atong future kung unsaon na nato siya pag-handle. Then ang negative is kuan kanang grabe bitaw og pagkalisod ang ato ang mga sana kababayan adto nga time. So mao po.
Okay. That is right, no? Of course, we cannot deny the fact that during the time of colonization, we were not given equal treatment. That's why there are quite revolutions, no, that happened. If you recall, na 1872 revolutions prior to the revolution in 1896, right? So these are things, no, na 1898 na revolution. Now, these are things now we have to acknowledge that it existed, that there are really tyranny during the time of colonization. But at the same time, just like what I said earlier, it brought us also another door, an opportunity to acknowledge that there are other places who have reached a different kind of civilization that advanced them, perhaps in moving forward with politics, technology, science, economics, and so on and so forth. But of course, wala ko nisulti nga wala tayong nana. But they have different lang na setup. Than of us, mas dako ang ilahang scope because global lang scope. Then at that time, the Philippines is very regional ang idea. No, if you can probably read some of the accounts or a book coming from Nick Joaquin na siya gisulat dito. the heritage of smallness. Nganong ang idea sa mga Pilipino ginagmay, it comes from also, aside from its geographical location, but our perception is very limited to the region that we belong to. Mao nang basta ang affected nga area gani is naa sa Luzon, dili kayo na mabati sa mga naa diri sa Pilipinas, naa diri sa Mindanao, no? We are more on division because our thinking is that the Filipinos are Filipinos because they are in this region only, right? Morortang dito ba, taga Manila man na sila, bahala na sila. No, or taga Cebu man na sila, bahala na sila. Sila may apektado, dili man kita. And vice versa. No, the other people are also thinking that way. Though at some point karon ni change na siya. But if you can recall, no, during the time na naay problem crisis, typhoon crisis in the northern part of the zone, there were a lot of questions. Where's the president, or where was the president at that time? Pag diri na pud sa Mindanao, no, nagkabagyo diri sa Caraga, ni backlash pa rin taga-Caraga. Wa magay nangutana, no? Ang mga taga-Caraga, ang mga taga-Agusan del Sur, kung asa ang presidente. You see? The limitations of our idea, kung asa taman lang ang pagiging Filipino, lies only to our own borders, to our own region. Beyond our region, beyond our island, or beyond to the borders of our land, wala na kaayo tay pagbati. That at some point, no, dili Filipino ang treatment nato sa ila, but they are just probably Cebuano, Boholano, Ilonggo, no? So that's something that we have to think about, no? If we wanted really to have a unison progress from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, I think we have to cut down the idea of borders, no? Whether it is land or sea na borders, still we have to cut it down because that won't give us much of a progress and growth that we wanted, because nag-iya-iya aho-aho ta. Kabalo mo anang idea, di ba? Natin idea nga iya-iya aho-aho. If we compare our nation to other nations who are actually landlocked, say for example, well, China, since they are influenced man sa from their form of government, so nothing much yun kaayo. But say for example, South Korea. South Korea is very commendable when we talk about how the people are working together as one Koreans, right? During the 1999 or 98-99 Asian crisis, they are one of the most developed na nga country at that time, rising tigers na in Asia. But during the 1998-1999 na Asian crisis, what happened to their country is nalubong sila economically. And that's not even their fault, because it's the fault of everybody working as a global network. Later on, kasi gibuhat sa government sa Korea, because of course they're in constant threat man, diba? They're in constant threat with their northern part, ang North Korea. So for them to fully safeguard their country, of course kung wala na kay income, no, low kayang imuhang ekonomiya, wala kay pang budget for defense, and they're in constant threat again with North Korea. So sige buhat sa mga tao sa South Korea, they actually donated everything na pwede nila ma-donate, no? They were asked by the government, kinsa tong mo donate, whether you are an ordinary man or you are a very rich man, you are encouraged to donate. Probably kung depende sa imo kung all of your wealth bang imong i-donate to save the country from really losing its economic condition at that time. So they are expecting to recover from Asian crisis for 10 years, but they were able to bounce back for at least 3 to 5 years. That's because of the people, no? So adto sa mga mall, adto sa mga government offices, digto nila ipangbutang ilang mga gold nga bracelet, ilang mga relo, tanan nga pwede mabaligya, ma-monetize mo ni gibuhat sa South Korea, because they are not thinking that they are coming from another Korean peninsula, right? They are thinking as one Koreans. But if we ask the Filipinos, are we really thinking that every one of us are Filipinos? Or this is just, you know, an idea coming from a discussion that we're doing right now? But at the end of the day, afterwards, no, we go back and criticize others because they are not like, no, Agusanon, or they're not like Cebuanos or Manileños, right? So until we have that kind of mentality, we might be having a lot of problems pa if we talk about developing as a nation. No, as long as we don't cooperate, as long as we segregate ourselves, then it's quite hard. All right. Well, it's already 6 in the evening. I think we have discussed and deliver, the essential topics in our online sync, especially talking about Butuan or Limasawa tradition. So if you have questions later in your mind, just PM me or message me. I'll try to answer you if really not busy. By the way, before I forget, ang atong final exam is last week sa March, no? I'm only giving you 2 modules na lang. Week 9 will be finished this week and probably basing week 10 pod this week lang gihapon. I am just juggling my time kay daghan pod og activities aside from working as teacher na pa may mga lain pod nga gipangbuhat. Especially I'm editing one of couple na of modules from DepEd, di ba na may module on DepEd. I'm one of the validators to edit their work because kinahanglan nila. That's why unsahay dili ko ka-attend sa tuang mga online sync because we're only given very limited time kay of course ang DepEd nagdali pod sa ilahang modules and we are very committed on helping other institutions because DepEd also has helped PNU in a lot of ways. So in order to give back, we are also helping them. Because of course, the mga first batch sa module na kitatag na yung mga gamay ng mga errors, no? Especially for social formation, nadamay na sila Angel Luxine, sila Coco Martin, o kinsa pa itong mga artista. Right? So we are trying to check on that. Medyo busy, but we're trying really our best to juggle time and to balance everything. So I hope you understand. Just read the module, and if you have questions or delays of your submission, it's okay as long as masubmit niyo prior to finals, no? Kung kaya. Kay magbuhat sa kogrado din mag-check na pod. Okay? So daghan pag-check on. All right, sige. Napay mga pangutana before we end this one? Okay, sige. Goodbye, Obtec 15. I'll post the video later pag ma-edit na pod nako so that ang kadong mga classmates ninyo wala diri makakita. In other sections as well, they choose to view na lang the recordings that we just did kay napod sila lain pang ipangbuhat. Okay? So I'll stop the recording na and also I will stop